So, I have two talks today. The first talk, both talks are short, so I decided to combine them together. The first talk is about meditation, focusing largely on the Pali Canon, called Integral Buddhism, the Essence of Meditation. In that talk, I'm essentially trying to discover the essential view of meditation that lies at the core of the Pali Canon. And the second talk is on Dzogchen, the highest jhana of the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, the original school of Tibetan Buddhism, and also widely practiced in other schools in Tibet as well. So one focusing on the beginning and one focusing on the culmination, if you like, of the development of Mahayana and then Vajrayana Buddhism, and together trying really to discover what is the essence of meditation, the essential idea of Buddhist meditation as such, as distinct from all of the traditionally numbered 84,000 techniques that Buddhist techniques are traditionally divided into. So, beginning with Integral Buddhism, the essence of meditation. And the total talk will take approximately 15 minutes, followed by question and answers. However, if you have any questions, it's whatever you're asking about is uppermost in the mind of myself and of everyone else. So, the essence of meditation. It's not correct to speak of meditation in the Pali Canon. Rather, one should refer to meditations in the plural. The Buddha did not merely teach one method of meditation. Rather, he taught numerous methods, each suited to the personal needs of the individual with whom he was speaking, and therefore, arguably, one could say that the Buddha taught an infinite number of meditations, if every meditation teaching is specifically tailored to the individual. And similarly, one could say that the Buddha taught an infinity of dharmas, since the same principle applies to teaching dharma. He tailored what he taught to his hearers, what they needed to hear, what was appropriate for them. These are included in the 84,000 Dhammakanda, literally Dhamma collection. The number 84 is not arbitrary. It's an ancient sacred Vedic number that also appears in Sumerian culture, and there are evidence for a linkage between Indus Valley civilization and Sumerian culture, and therefore between Vedic civilization and Sumerian culture. 84 is 7 times 12, the number of anciently known planets multiplied by the number of signs of the zodiac. It's also 8, which is 2 times 4, and 4, the symbol of infinity, the Buddhist endless knot, and the 4 elements. It also adds up to 12, 3 times 4. It's also the duration of the lunisolar calendrical cycle, being the product of 3, 4, and 7. This cycle was also used by the Celtic Christians to calculate Easter. Interestingly, it is also the period of Uranus. It's also a positive feng shui number. 84 times 1,000 is therefore a number of completeness and spirituality. Thus, when we speak of the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha, we refer, in addition to being a large number, to their qualities of completeness and totality, especially in relation to higher consciousness. The Pali Canon includes references to many different types of meditation. Sarah Shaw collects many of these texts in her book, Buddhist Meditation, an anthology of texts from the Pali Canon, published in London by Routledge in 2006. Very good anthology, which I recommend if you're balking at reading the entire Pali Canon, which is about 40 volumes in length. Anthologies are always nice, although they invariably simplify and sometimes oversimplify the matter. However, Shaw's book is a very good representation of meditation-oriented texts selected from throughout the Pali Canon. One of the best known of these is the metta meditation, in which one projects feelings of love and compassion to the 6 directions, consisting of the 4 horizontal directions, north, south, east, and west, plus the above and the below, the zenith and the nadir. This meditation is frequently mentioned in the Pali Canon, and in addition to, I'll just point out one other brief thing I've learned about the metta meditation recently is it's generally understood to be a meditation on spreading feelings of altruism, compassion, and love in all the directions. But it's also a centering meditation, which develops calmness, the quality of calmness in the heart in particular, and also an exercise in the expansion of consciousness, which one discovers when one looks at all the references in the Pali Canon to the metta meditation and collates them together. However, in this talk, I'd like to take an integral approach to the topic of Buddhist meditation. For if there are 84,000 iterations of something, then there must be an underlying unity of which there are 84,000 iterations. This is consistent with my overall desire to universalize and unify all the different historical and cultural traditions of Buddhism in the Dharma, what I call the Dharma transmission to the West. That unity is mindfulness, the essence of meditation. In Pali, the word is sati. In taking this approach to Buddhist meditation, I'm influenced by Sri Aurobindo and by Ken Wilber, but I will be largely using Shaw's translations, aided by the comprehensive understanding of the Pali Canon that I'm building up as a consequence of my personal vow to read the Pali Canon through 5 times over the next 5 years. And some of you, of course, are aware that we've just completed a 34-week series of talks on the Digha Nikaya, the first Nikaya of the Sutta Pitaka of the Pali Canon, and that I'm publishing these in a book probably in the next few weeks. It will be about a 450-page cloth-bound book published through my press, chronikerpress.com. In order to achieve this integral view, I'll be keeping this discussion as universal as possible. So I'm not going to really get into the specifics of all the different types of meditations, although, of course, to some extent, that's inevitable. As I've discussed in my talk, the status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition, the Buddha clearly taught that women are capable of emancipation, despite the highly patriarchal and indeed misogynistic views of the Arhants of the First Buddhist Council. And if you haven't heard that talk, it is available on my blog at www.palisuttas.com. It's also available at my Dharma Center that I mentioned in Maya. In the bookshelf, just click on the bookshelf and you have a selection of not quite 100 note cards you can choose from. One of the consistent themes relating to meditation in the Pali Canon is where it is conducted. Originally, the Buddha Sangha did not occupy monasteries and they did not meditate enclosed in temples. Rather, they meditated in the forest, outdoors, either in secluded places or perhaps in huts. So to that extent, they did have a covering. Later on, they meditated in parks donated by wealthy patrons, such as the Kirtasan Ambapali. Of course, one reason for meditating out of doors in the forest was seclusion, which is the precondition of the first jhana and frequently mentioned in the texts. This seclusion is not merely, or even perhaps primarily, external, however. The Buddha makes it clear that external rites and practices are in themselves of little value. Rather, real seclusion consists in withdrawing the mind from attachment to stimuli, including sensory stimuli and the stimuli of the mind itself. In Buddhism, the mind is simply seen as a sixth sense. However, the texts themselves frequently allude to the quality of natural beauty as another significant factor, in addition to subsequent Buddhist practice. Historically, Buddhist monasteries are not merely located in remote places, they're also located in places of great natural beauty, so-called power points. This is somewhat paradoxical, but Shaw herself notes that emancipation seems to enhance one's appreciation of the natural, even though the explicit goal of emancipation, and here's the paradox, is transcendence of the natural. This paradox may represent a survival of the deep shamanic roots of Buddhist theory and practice, something that we see elsewhere as well. The practice of solitude is therefore not merely negative, it results in the stirring of energy that itself furthers the attainment of the meditative state. And this is actually a pervasive factor that one finds throughout the Pali Canon, that things are cast in a negative tone in the Pali Canon, which actually from a transcendent perspective, which is to say from the Buddha's perspective, may be looked at again in a different light as having a far more positive tone than the Pali texts, which are, after all, focused on samsara, suggest. Another significant factor that arises in the practice of meditation that leads to the experience of emancipation is what Shaw refers to as the moment, a surprise event or shock that results in an instantaneous change of state in the context of meditative practice. The influential European mystic George Ivanovich Gurdjieff also refers to it in his doctrine of the shock. Shaw mentions schools that regard this as a necessary preliminary to enlightenment, referring probably to Zen, but it is certainly also found in the Pali Canon. I've referred to this in previous talk as well. Ananda refers to this as the fourth cause of enlightenment, along with serenity and insight. And this is also discussed, I've also discussed this in Chapter 8 of my book, Fundamental View, 10 Talks on the Pali Canon, which I am representing at the Dharma by the Tracks Dharma Center on Saturdays at 11 a.m. I think we just finished number 3 in the series of 10 talks on the Pali Canon. So if you're interested in hearing those, the next one will be this Saturday at 11 a.m. Second Lifetime in Maya Sim. Sometimes this attainment results in the spontaneous utterance of ecstatic poetry, and we have 2 volumes of this in the Pali Canon, the so-called Therigatha and the Theragatha. We've just published a book translated by Bhikkhu Sujato of his translation of the Therigatha. I don't actually recall if it's the Therigatha is by the nuns, poems of the nuns, and the Theragatha is poems by the monks. I think it's the monks one that he's actually translated and published, but I'm not sure offhand. I'd have to check that. And that's available from chronicapress.com. Meditation, while necessary, is not sufficient to attain emancipation, however. The Buddha says that meditation without wisdom is ineffective, and that wisdom without meditation is ineffective. The two need to be combined in order to achieve emancipation. But the Dalai Lama says this as well in a very interesting YouTube video, that meditation pursued without reference to the cultivation of knowledge or wisdom can actually lead to a kind of psychological dullness, which is not obviously the intention at all. But it's clear from the texts, even though the two do need to be together, that the cultivation of wisdom is the first and essential salvific principle, corresponding to the attainment of right view and the stage of a stream enterer or a stream winner. The Pali word is sotapanna. Sometimes translated stream winner, more correct translation is stream enterer or stream entrant. Converts are typically shown hearing Dhamma discourse by the Buddha, by which they are then known as hearers or sawakas, and then going into solitude for a short period of meditation, followed by the attainment of arhantship. In fact, Peter Macefield, author of Divine Revelation in the Pali Canon, suggests that this experience of oral transmission is actually essential, an essential step in the going forth, which leads ultimately to emancipation. And it must be specifically oral. It must be an oral transmission. Something which you find, which he's finding in the Pali Canon, interestingly enough, that of course this doctrine becomes a cornerstone of Tantra and the whole concept of a lineage or transmission. Contrary to what one often reads in popular expositions of Buddhism, Meditation does not need to be pursued for years, decades, or lifetimes in order to achieve emancipation. The Buddha says that as short a time as 1 week will do, depending, of course, on one's karmic readiness. And in fact, there are examples in the Pali Canon of arahantship being attained as quickly as in 5 days after this initial oral transmission. This is probably an approximation, since, as I said, Kondanya and several others attained emancipation after 5 days of continuous meditation. Interestingly, there are several examples of 5 days, but the Buddha always says, as far as I know, he always says 7. I haven't seen him say 5 in any text that I've read so far. One of the essentials of meditation that appears throughout the Pali Canon, and indeed the whole Indian and Buddhist tradition, is the cross-legged posture. This is the paradigmatic physical position in which meditation is undertaken. Seated, the legs are crossed, the pelvis elevated above the knees, and the hands are placed together in the lap or sometimes on the knees. The spine is straight, the shoulders square, the head tipped slightly forward, and the gaze, neither focused nor unfocused, with eyelids neither completely closed nor completely open, directed towards the middle ground, neither far nor near. This posture is a physical embodiment of the balanced, harmonious state of the middle way, both horizontal and vertical. The middle way, of course, being the Buddha's term for Buddhism, for his teaching. The crossing of the ankles and the hands creates a closed energy loop whereby the subtle energies of the body begin to circulate internally. This posture is very ancient, going back at least to the Indus Valley civilization, so thousands of years older than Buddhism. Buddhism in the modern historical sense, of course, not in the ultimate sense of Buddhism as Dharma, which is timeless and universal. Retiring to a secluded natural spot, seating oneself in the cross-legged posture, centering oneself in the present moment, the now, practicing awareness of the body and arousing energy. What one finds most frequently emphasized throughout the Pali texts is the practice of breathing mindfulness. The Buddha says that this method of meditation includes everything required to attain emancipation. The Buddha refers to it uniquely as the Tathagata's dwelling, the only meditation practice to which he applies that term. And he practiced it himself even after his enlightenment, interestingly. So the Buddha still felt a need to practice spiritual techniques even after his official enlightenment at the age of 35. In the Buddhist system, one does not try to control the breathing, but simply directs one's attention to the exhalation and the inhalation as they occur. The breath will deepen and become more refined naturally. The mind will become still. Consciousness itself will come to the forefront, while thoughts will become transparent, mirage-like, and secondary, and progressively diminish in intensity and frequency. Thought ultimately disappears. The body is suffused with bliss. Shaw cites Buddhaghosa's comment that mindfulness of the body, note, is a practice unique to the Buddha Dharma. According to the Pali Canon, mindfulness of the body alone is capable of bringing the practitioner to emancipation. So, interestingly, since Buddhism has a reputation as being an ascetic philosophy with a relentless pursuit of transcendence, the focal point of meditation according to the Buddha is actually the body that is immediately present. The Buddha also recommends a visualization practice in which the body is imagined as being suffused with light. Shaw notes that some of the visualizations described in the Pali Canon are reminiscent of the practices taught in Northern or Tantric Buddhism, once again demonstrating my thesis that one finds the seeds of Tantra in the Pali tradition. And actually that's been one of the themes of my series of talks on the Digha Nikaya, which I'm also emphasizing in the book version. This practice culminates in the direct realization of the natural radiance of the empty mind, the quality of self-conscious sentience devoid of content. This is the kinetic mind stream, or mental continuum, the Tseten in Pali, that is the true self of the individual as distinct from the false self of the static atta or atman, which of course everyone knows the Buddha rejected, the concept of a fixed or static self, which is merely a projection of the ego and an object of attachment. This quality is experienced naturally in the moment between thoughts, although this moment is so infinitesimal that it is normally not noticed, in deep sleep, at death, and perhaps at other times as well. Thus, deep sleep is meditation without reflexivity. Meditation is deep sleep with reflexivity. In fact, this is the literal meaning of mindfulness. The Pali word is sati, which literally means self-recollection, or memory, self-remembrance, self-awareness, reflexivity. This concept, which occurs in the Pali Suttas, is the forerunner of the Mahayana concepts of the clear light, and also the Tathagata Garbha, the Buddha nature, or Buddha embryo, that is the inherent potential of every sentient being, inherent in the very idea of sentience itself. It is what sentience is. Its full realization is equivalent to enlightenment itself. Any person who attains this state, even for a moment, is declared by the Buddha to be ordained. And similarly, later Mahayana schools say that any person who entertains the sincere intention, even for a moment, to achieve Buddhahood, sooner or later that karmic cause must come to fruition because of the principle of the law of karma, that there is no cause without an effect, there is no effect without a cause. The two things are indissoluble. According to the Pali Canon, this radiance is actually visible and results in a clear, bright complexion that develops in the course of meditation. This is the origin, of course, of the halo that appears in the portraits of Buddhist saints, which is, of course, subsequently taken over by Christianity. Monastic Christianity was actually historically influenced by Buddhism. Whether Yeshua himself was influenced by Buddhism is possible, because Ashoka did send missionaries in the 3rd century, before the Common Era, to the West, including Greece, Egypt, and I believe Rome as well. So it's possible that Yeshua was actually influenced by Buddhism. Regardless, certainly the later monastic tradition of Christianity was definitely influenced historically by Buddhism. Similarly, monks in the Pali Canon are consistently described as healthy, fit, and attractive, to the point where women are constantly seeking them out and tempting them to break their vows. Other subjects recommended by the Buddha for meditation that leads to emancipation include the Buddha himself and the Devas, the higher dimensional beings, from whom the Buddha also received teachings, according to the Pali Canon. The Buddha recommended the recollection of the Devas, the word literally means shining beings, at the time of death. In addition, the mindfulness of the breathing, in addition to mindfulness of the breathing, the Buddha also practiced the meditation on the Buddha, and in his own case, he meditated on Buddhas of the past. These practices, including chanting, purify karma and the mind, thus eliminating impediments and obscurations and progressively revealing the self-radiance that is inherent in sentience itself. Chanting has been found to purify the spinal fluid, for example. The Buddha likens this process to the purification of gold ore. The practice of meditation leads to the cultivation and progressive refinement of the mind, culminating in the 4th jhana, a word that I've translated as ecstasy, characterized by equanimity, a state of freedom from pleasure and pain, the indifference of serenity and mental integration or one-pointedness, sometimes translated as concentration, samadhi. In this state, one ceases to be aware of one's breathing. The texts imply that breathing itself stops. Whether or not this is objectively true or simply a shift in awareness, I'm not privy to that knowledge. The realization of the fourth jhana leads to the attainment of psychic powers, or edi, including astral projection, and I'm using common terms here. The term used in the Pali Canon is the mind-made body. Tibetans refer to the body of light, or the rainbow body. Western esotericists refer to the body of light. Common term is astral projection. Clairaudience, clairvoyance, the recollection of past lives. This one much emphasized in the Pali Canon. And seeing the karma of others, the so-called divine eye. The mind-made body, which the Buddha states is created magically, and I have a note about that word. The Pali word is abhiniminati, suggesting of abhi plus nimanati. Nimanati or nimitta means to build, to fashion, to create, to produce, or to shape, whereas abhi, clearly derives from idi, which means power, potency, psychic power, supernatural power, magical power, miraculous faculty, or miracle. Maurice Walsh translates this compound simply as produce, whereas Shaw includes the connotation of spiritual or psychic power or potency. And the latter is the more literal and etymologically correct translation, pointing out the necessity of really, when you're reading English translations of Pali texts especially, I guess Poitel says, nimitta is a phenomenon during meditation as far as I know, so it has an additional meaning. Perhaps it does. I'm only interpreting it in this specific context. I'm not sufficient. I could certainly look up the word and advise you on that later, whether or not it's used elsewhere as a synonym for meditation itself, or perhaps a specific phenomenon during meditation. I'm not privy to that. I'm just interpreting it in the context of this specific passage. So I'm afraid I can't advise you on other uses of that word in the Pali Canon, not being a Pali linguist myself. However, it does point out the importance of making yourself aware and being conscious of the fact when you're reading a translation of what the Pali words might be that are underlying the words that are being chosen by the scholars who are doing the translations. This is especially relevant to Pali studies because, of course, the Pali Canon is the traditional canon of Theravada Buddhism, which has its own particular interpretation of what the Dharma is, and may shy away from a term like magical, even though that's an appropriate translation of the original text, as in this case, a magical mind-made body. It's not a metaphor. It's an actual physical experience. The sensation of one's body literally slipping out of one's feet is an indescribable and unforgettable experience, as I can tell you. Okay, so that completes the first part of the 2 talks on meditation, on the essence of meditation, based largely on the Pali Canon. Before we go on to the second talk, which goes to the other end and discusses Dzogchen, the highest, considered by the Nyingma school to be the highest vehicle, Buddhist vehicle in Tibetan Buddhism. Does anyone have any questions about what we've discussed so far before we go on to Dzogchen? I'm just going to, oh, I see a question. Oh, okay, great, thank you very much. I'll look at that. It's also possible the term became incorporated into the Abhidhamma texts, where it became a more, the meaning became more rigorous or rigid. A lot of concepts are gathered up into the Abhidhamma from the suttas, where they are more amorphous and less defined, and then organized into a more systematic body of thought in the Abhidhamma. So that's another possibility, is that this term has been picked up and clarified and made into a phase of meditation rather than a synonym for meditation itself. In any case, let me just refill my glass of water, and then we'll go on to the second talk. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so let's go on to talk 2, the practice of Dzogchen, beginning with the origin and provenance of Dzogchen. The Tibetan word Dzogchen means the great completeness. Within Buddhism, Dzogchen is associated with the original Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism. Dzogchen also found its way, it's also found, I should say, in the older Bon tradition of Tibet. But the direction of influence is uncertain. It's not, so there was a lot of exchange of ideas between Bon and Tibetan Buddhism, but they become very much assimilated to each other, so it's difficult to say which way it went, the influence. We do know, however, that Dzogchen was introduced to Tibet by Padmasambhava, the Buddhist tantric adept, who is credited with the conversion of Tibet to the Buddha Dharma in the late 8th century of the Common Era. That's, of course, the Om Ahung Benzu Guru Pema Siddhi Hung mantra with which I begin each of my talks as a devotee personally of Padmasambhava. Padmasambhava left Tibet in 774 of the Common Era, having transmitted only part of the Dzogchen tradition before his departure. Over the subsequent centuries, many so-called terma, or hidden treasure texts, were discovered by a variety of spiritual practitioners, including the famous Liberation Through Hearing in the Bardo. The Prajnaparamita is also traditionally a terma text, a pre-Tibetan. Okay, Dixie Doolittle, thank you very much for attending. All of these texts concern Dzogchen and were attributed to Padmasambhava. The Dzogchen tradition was subsequently developed in Tibet by other Dzogchen masters, including Virachana and Vimalamitra. Padmasambhava himself received the Dzogchen transmission from Garab Dorji in what is now known as the Swat Valley. Disputed, but that's the mainstream view, that he came from the Swat Valley, from which Padmasambhava himself also originated. This called Odayana in the texts, and the mainstream view does identify the Odayana with the Swat Valley, but that is not without its different views. This area is referred to as Odayana in Sanskrit and Orgyen in Tibetan. This region was associated with the development and dissemination of early Vajrayana Buddhism and became the basis of the Shambhala mythos. Dzogchen texts were never included in the Kangyur, which therefore lie outside the sectarian organizational system of the Tibetan ecclesiastical establishment. Nevertheless, it is widely practiced throughout Tibetan Buddhism by all sects and schools, and in the Nyingma system, Dzogchen is regarded as the highest yana or vehicle of Buddhist teaching and practice. The main Dzogchen system practiced today is based on Longchenpa's Height Essence teachings, revised by Jime Lingpa and amplified by the first Dodrubchen. But these are merely culturally and historically contingent interpretations. Dzogchen itself is not a system, like the Dharma itself, nor is it subject to samsara by definition. It's also considered transcendent to both Sutra and Tantra, and indeed universal, although again this point is contested within Tibetan orthodoxy, I'm basing my views on Dzogchen largely on the practice of Gompapa and the original texts. I'm not that interested in sectarian perspectives. Dzogchen is the highest possible realization of enlightenment itself, and therefore the holiest and most precious teaching. Dzogchen philosophy includes ontology, soteriology, and ethics, which is to say, of course, ontology, the science of being, or the nature of reality, soteriology, the science of salvation, and finally ethics, of course, the practice of morality. According to the Tibetan ecclesiastical system of the Nyingma, Dzogchen is the highest Buddhist jhana or vehicle and can only be practiced properly after satisfying a number of conditions. This is the organizationalist view, which if interpreted strictly could be quite onerous. These prerequisites of Dzogchen practice, however, seem to contradict Dzogchen's emphasis on the non-causal path, in which, according to the formula, the goal of the practice is taken as the practice itself. It appears rather that Dzogchen has been appropriated and incorporated into a causalist structure as its apex and crown, in which the essential preconditions of practice have been elaborated into a system, the primary motive for which is to maintain the power and authority of an ecclesiastical hierarchy that sought to limit access to, and therefore control, the Vajrayana teachings. Nevertheless, these elaborate preconditions are not universally observed, and I'll just give you a short quote to demonstrate that point. Quoting, as scholar David Jackson describes, the particular Kagyu tradition of pointing out instruction outside of the Tantras was popularized, if not originated, by Gampopa. One of the special Great Seal, or Mahamudra teachings for which Gampopa was best known was his so-called introduction to the nature of mind, by which the disciple was led to confront and directly recognize the nature of his or her mind. Gampopa is said to have given such Great Seal instructions, sometimes not as secret Vajrayana precepts in connection with initiation and special yogic practices, but rather as a sutra-based Great Seal instruction, or even as a doctrine going beyond both sutra and tantra. Later critics, such as Saskya Pandita, or Sapan as he was known for short, maintained, however, that all true Great Seal instructions were mantrayana teachings that necessitated full formal tantric initiation into a mandala. These masters denied in general the existence of any sutra-based or non-tantric Great Seal, and in particular they considered the existence of any Mahayana doctrine outside of the classes of Paramitayana and Mantrayana to be impossible. Unquote, that's from the Wikipedia, and I can give you a few other references along these lines if you're interested in pursuing it further. But anyway, that's my perspective, is the perspective of Gampopa. Hence, the reason that I'm able to talk about it to you today. Now, let me just figure out where I was. Sorry, I just had to go to a footnote. Now I have to find my way back. There we go. According to the orthodox approach, the practice of Dzogchen is preceded by the practice of Nyundro, which is in turn preceded by the so-called common preliminaries. Nyundro, however, was invented during the 16th century of the Common Era. Dr. Alex Berzin has stated that no one can approach Dzogchen meditation who has not spent many years practicing a samatha or shinye, tranquility meditation. Again, these requirements smack of causalism and an imposition of later times, both as a way to protect the teachings during a period of great ignorance, but also as a way of establishing and maintaining the power and authority of the religious elites. When one analyzes these preliminaries, one discovers that they are all essentially identical with Dzogchen itself. Indeed, this is true of all practices, for Dzogchen, as the highest, is also the universally inherent spiritual practice that incorporates all other spiritual practices into itself, and of which all other spiritual practices are aspects. Therefore, in my interpretation, the essence or the moment of meditation itself, which we were looking to explicate before within the Pali Canon. Therefore, there is no theoretical objection to pursuing Dzogchen directly rather than through an historically and culturally contingent program. And actually, in the West, this seems to be becoming more and more the case as books on Dzogchen multiply like mushrooms. A single example will suffice. Much is made of the fact that one must experience Rigpa before one can practice Dzogchen in a satisfactory way. But Dzogchen and Rigpa are really the same thing. So what is being said here, and I'm sure some classic philosophers will split hairs here, but we know these two from our own Western traditions, don't we? Moreover, in the next breath, it's stated that Rigpa is the natural state of the mind and therefore universally inherent in all living beings, including human beings, yet somehow obscured from itself by involvement in samsara. This is true. This is the essential paradox of the transdual. Nevertheless, as the natural state of the mind, where else can we look for Rigpa other than to the mind itself, which, as stated, is our universal endowment? Therefore, it does not take years of meditation to experience Rigpa. Anyone can see it instantly simply by choosing to look at it. You do not even need to close your eyes, it's right here. This is really the most radical pointing out instruction. Making things seem more difficult than they really are is an old ploy of those who wish to control access to knowledge. Nyandro is a system of practice widespread through India, and in its simplest basis consists of 6 moments. And I say moments rather than stages because any 6 of these practices can really be practiced as a practice in its own right, not merely as a component or stage of Nyandro. And sometimes also in different Nyandro traditions the order changes. And I'll post these in the chat, what these 6 moments of Nyandro are. So the first one is taking refuge, the second is prostration, the third is bodhicitta, the fourth is mantra, the fifth is offering the mandala, and the sixth is guru yoga. These practices are held to purify pride, jealousy, hatred, attachment, and delusion. Each of these practices must be repeated 100,000 times at least in order to be recognized, quote-unquote, as a qualified quote-unquote Dzogchen practitioner. Some more Tibetan groups follow this structure, but others, such as Dzogchen Ponlat Rinpoche, don't necessarily follow this structure rigidly, and some don't follow it at all. Moreover, according to this theory, they must be practiced under the direct authority of a qualified lama, who one is also bound to regard as a living Buddha. However, this structure commits several essential errors, either directly or by implication. First, it implies the error of causalism. Second, it implies that enlightenment is obtainable mechanistically by the following of rules. Third, it implies that quantity is superior to quality. The Buddha himself stated that there is no correlation between attaining enlightenment and time. Awakening may be attained in as long a time as 7 rebirths or in as short a time as a single week. Therefore, duration is not the significant factor. Fourth, it is historically and culturally contingent. It is an origin in the 16th century, which is quite late. Fifth, therefore, many great Tibetan masters never practiced Nyandro. Fifth, it is sectarian, which is a violation of the Bodhisattva vow. In fact, there are many variations of Nyandro. Sixth, it ignores the factor of karma. Seventh, it subordinates the individual to the authority, contrary to the Buddha's final advice to seek the light within oneself. Similar statement by Longchenpa says, quote, "Therefore rid yourself completely of close relationships of dependency and followers, friends, or relatives, and make a definite effort from today on to practice the hallowed Dharma. alone in isolation. Supreme hallowed beings of the past have said that from living in isolation they found the nectar of Dharma experience. Therefore resolve that I too shall live alone in isolation in a forest in order to actualize a state of being stilled. Living in isolation has been praised by the triumphant Buddhas. With no one unruly around you, you increase your absorbed concentration on what is profound. You naturally practice the Dharma and develop somber thoughts of impermanence. You put material possessions aside and have no busy work or distractions. That's Longchenpa from the A Precious Garland of the Four Themes, translated by Alex Berzin. And is a reiteration of statements made by the Buddha in the Pali Canon. There's nothing eccentric or heterodox about that passage. Eighth, it's based on a falsehood, that is, that the Lama is a Buddha, except in the sense that we all are, or in some symbolic sense. Very, very rare, unlikely it is that you're going to meet a Buddha in your lifetime. And finally, ninth, it is based on a metaphysical error for what are pride, jealousy, hatred, attachment, and delusion in themselves. According to the view, the purpose of Nyandro is to purify the karmic obscurations. This is the same thinking that underlies the path of asceticism that the Buddha rejected just prior to his enlightenment. However, there are no karmic obscurations in reality, samsara itself being essentially illusory. Since there are no karmic obscurations, there is no need to purify oneself of them. One has only to recognize the identity of nirvana and samsara, and this is done by Dzogchen. On the other hand, the Buddha identifies meditation with renunciation and karmic purification. Ethics as such are irrelevant. This is true emancipation. The self-practitioner can satisfy these requirements by aspiring to the absolute guru, the Tathagata Garbha, calling upon Padmasambhava as the universal guru himself, as Lama, to witness his refuge in the Dharma and his correlative view of aspiration, the bodhicitta. By calling upon Guru Rinpoche, the transmission occurs automatically. Dzogchen itself, as the universal and essential spiritual practice, subsumes prostration, mantra, mandala, and religion. None is necessary. They may have utility, they may be skillful means or upaya, but they're not essential. And what we're seeking in this inquiry is the essential moment of meditation. In the age of near universal ignorance, not so distant from or dissimilar from our own time, when ignorance is spreading like wildfire, transmission was the essential means by which the spiritual integrity of understanding and practice was communicated from guru to disciple. We noted that Nyandro was invented in the 16th century. The age of degeneration began in the year 1012, so this is 500 years into the age of degeneration. So here we can see a reason for the organizationalist structure which was built around these practices in Tibet. As the repository and channel of spiritual teachings, that teacher was held in highest esteem, and of course the Buddha himself advocates respect for the teacher in the Pali Canon, the centrality, importance of the teacher, and respect for the teacher. Such transmission was always private, secret, and intimate, not involving crowds of hundreds or thousands or communicated at a distance through a vertical ecclesiastical hierarchy. Therefore, people who join organizations and think that they have a relationship with a lama are very much mistaken. This was there are comparatively few people who have an actual teaching relationship with a lama. This was the environment in which Dzogchen flourished. Nevertheless, the Buddha eschewed secrecy and condemned it amongst the Brahmins. The common preliminaries all refer to right view, the first step of the Aryan Eightfold Path, specifically the preciousness of human rebirth, change or anicca, the doctrine of change, transitoriety, impermanence, karma, the law of karma, and suffering or angst. The Pali word, of course, is dukkha. In other words, the foundation of practice is wisdom. wisdom and method. If one recognizes and accepts the truth of these doctrines, not merely as abstract theoretical concepts, but as spiritual facts that one has personally realized experientially, and therefore the attainment of right view is already a high attainment, even though it is only the first level of the Noble Eightfold Path, it is in itself advanced spiritual attainment. One has already fulfilled the preliminary requirements without regard to any ritual that in itself is meaningless. And the Buddha reiterated definitively in the Pali Canon that the ultimate path is individual, is of, for, and by the individual. The Buddha said that a Brahmin is not made by birth or caste or by wearing a robe, but by their personal and spiritual qualities. Similarly, the true spiritual practitioner cannot be restrained or inhibited by external social, political, or even ecclesiastical criteria, but is established only in and by himself or herself. The Buddha himself was self-ordained and self-recognized. He warned his disciples against attachment to rules and beliefs, and based the hierarchy of the order purely on seniority, not claims of spiritual preeminence, rejecting the efforts of Devadatta to impose an even more rigorous external discipline. As stated above, Rigpa, our own natural sentience that is the universal ground of all living beings, is inherently devoid of reflexivity. This is the essential condition that underlies even ignorance, and is therefore more fundamental than the pratitya samutpada, or the doctrine of dependent origination, the 12 linkages that the Buddha used to trace the origin of our present suffering ultimately in ignorance through a series of 12 intermediate steps. It's ontologically given. This non-reflexivity of Rigpa gives rise to the phantasmagoria of experience that we call samsara. Because Rigpa is not aware of its own intrinsic nature or ignorance, it becomes attached to the objects of experience to which it attributes its own qualities of permanence, self-identity, and satisfactoriness. This is the essential condition in which we find ourselves. We can speculate about why or how it is that this is so, but such discussion is ultimately futile. Therefore, the essential endeavor of Dzogchen is to reestablish the reflexive state. This is done by a simple act of the mind, recognizing the objects of experience, both gross and subtle, as essential voidness, and redirecting, as it were, turning the attention, the intention, towards the simple, perfectly empty state of Rigpa, sentience that is already present in the mind, but non-reflexive. Not just present in the mind, but is the mind. This is synonymous with enlightenment itself, and includes within itself both wisdom, that is the recognition of the true nature of things, and ethics, that is self-control. Indeed, Dzogchen is the highest and most universal path that contains all paths, traditions and practices within itself. Nothing else is required, but the Dzogchen practitioner may make full use of all of them as he or she will. So if one is grounded in Dzogchen, one can use all of these 84,000 techniques to support one's practice, but if one is not grounded in Dzogchen, one is apt to become attached to the practice itself and therefore enter into a state of delusion. Specifically, the delusion of causalism, which exists as one of two extremes, causalism and immediate or spontaneous enlightenment, neither of which is exclusively true, being extremes. Therefore, Dzogchen alone is both fundamental and essential. Quoting from Za Patrul Rinpoche, meditation is to remain balanced, free of distraction, without particularly rejecting or accepting anything, and finally, being at ease. Okay, that completes my talk for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Before we conclude with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, Does anyone have any questions, comments, or discussion concerning anything we've addressed today? And I would invite you all to visit the Dharma by the Tracks, our new Dharma Center of the Dharma Transmission to the West group, located in the Maya Sim, where you can get note cards of these and other talks, as well as we have meetings there. And right now we're reading the Lotus Sutra, six evenings per month, plus doing a series of talks called Fundamental View, 10 talks on the Pali Canon at 11 a.m. every Saturday. So it looks like there's no questions. So let's proceed then with the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive forces come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege to do so. I'll be here again next Sunday at 2 o'clock p.m. Second Lifetime for another Dharma talk. Until then, Namaskar.